In science, we have a well-defined process for deciding what is mainstream and what is controversial, and it has nothing whatsoever to do with how many people believe something to be true or not. It's called peer review. We're dealing with issues of the life and death of our children and the future of our climate. And the way to deal with this is not to be fair and balanced, to borrow a phrase from a famous news outlet, but to report and explain the peer-reviewed scientific consensus accurately.
Everywhere you are told that man-made climate change is proved beyond doubt. But you are being told lies.
Martin Durkin's highly controversial documentary, The Great Global Warming Swindle, is, in my opinion, factually total bollocks, of course. Even though I don't agree with the point of view expressed in the film, I quite enjoyed it. It raised interesting questions about institutional power and the politicisation of science.
Scientists, accustomed to the relative civility and obscurity of academic life, suddenly find themselves publicly attacked if they dare to challenge the theory of man-made global warming. Vilified by campaign groups and even within their own universities.
The only possible way to tell the difference between a polemic and a documentary is to appeal to scientific peer review. What I can do is to offer an example where I think the filmmakers got the balance right by flagging the difference very clearly between the scientific consensus and the opinion of the presenter.
And it would have been lovely to have made a programme about how science had got it all wrong, that actually we've got nothing to worry about. But unfortunately it's the opposite. Most of the climate scientists I talk to are actually genuinely scared by the future. They're worried that it's in the nature of the climate to change far faster than we once thought possible. And my feeling is, if they're scared, so should we be.
Ian Stewart remains true to the science and true to television. And he does this by drawing a clear distinction in the viewer's mind between the peer-reviewed science and his opinion. I contend that controversial in science broadcasting should be defined in the same way as it is in science. That is, a controversial view is not one that runs counter to public opinion, but one that runs counter to the current scientific peer-reviewed consensus. This means that the most objective and therefore impartial presentation of a so-called contentious story, such as MMR, climate change, or even a so-called evolution debate, is to give significantly more weight to the scientifically peer-reviewed position, because this will leave the audience with a more truthful view of the current thinking. Now, it may seem there that I'm redefining what impartiality means, but the peer-reviewed consensus is by definition impartial.
One of the main things to have emerged from the ClimateGate emails was that the peer review process has been perhaps irredeemably corrupted.
Professor Wegman, he identified 42 people and said, look, these people are all publishing together and they're also peer reviewing each other's literature.
Dr. Mann continues to appeal to peer review, but the fact is the peer review process failed in the 1998 paper.
Okay, and you would say that was primarily because it was not an independent and separate review outside of that social network?
I believe that's the case. Yes.
Okay.
Can you explain your email to Hughes when you said you aren't going to make the data available to him because all he wants to do is find something wrong with it? That's the nature of scientific pursuit, isn't it?
Yes, I've obviously written some very awful emails, and I fully admit that.
That's very clear.
Yes, it is.
It's absolutely clear denial of this man's attempt to get at what you were doing.
I started saying, well, why are they pushing the peer review issue so big? Why are they saying, well, you haven't published peer review and you haven't done this peer review? And now, of course, we realize it's because they had control of their own process. That's clearly exposed in these emails.
I think whenever you hear somebody use the phrase peer-reviewed, you should reach for your Browning. Because peer-reviewed, I'm sorry to say, is a bankrupt notion since ClimateGate. Because what the ClimateGate emails from the University of East Anglia showed quite clearly was that the scientists at the heart of this process are shutting out of the peer review process any scientists who disagree with them.
They did not like the fact that I had a bunch of articles published in the refereed literature, and so they decided they would see who the editors were for those journals and try and influence their editorial decisions in the future. They said that they wanted to boycott certain journals if they published certain articles. Now, that means that the editors will all of a sudden certainly view things that might get them a boycott with a little bit of trepidation, and in fact there were resignations from these journals. That's really dangerous because it biases the refereed literature, and that's the canon of science that we all rely upon to make our consensual decisions.
Question for Lord Monckton. If you're so certain of the facts, why not debate the scientists on their own terms? Why won't you submit the research you say you've undertaken to a quality peer-reviewed journal to be assessed?
May I perhaps refer the Honourable Lady to Physics and Society for July 2008, where you will find an article entitled Climate Sensitivity Reconsidered. The author is Christopher Walter Monckton of Brenchley, and the article was indeed reviewed by Professor Alvin Saperstein, the Professor of Physics at Wayne State University, and also the review editor of the journal concerned at the time.
Society?
The American Physical Society, yes, that's right.
It says on their page that it's not peer reviewed.
Indeed it does. So why don't you check with Professor Saperstein to find out whether he in fact reviewed it? Have you done that? No, I didn't think you had. I have published in the reviewed literature. They try to say it wasn't peer review now, but they were perfectly happy to say it was peer review at the time. They were lent upon. This happens. You know, we too are sometimes victims of the other side going too far and putting too much pressure on. The two editors of that journal were sacked for publishing that paper. They shouldn't have been.
I don't think James, I mean, he's certainly shown no evidence of ever having read a peer-reviewed scientific paper.
Interesting you say peer review, which of course was one of the things that was discredited in ClimateGate. Peer review had been corrupted by these scientists involved.
Well, let him finish his point and then we'll have to leave it there.
That's very revealing. I mean, very revealing in that A, he hasn't denied it, and B, he now dismisses the entire basis of scientific endeavour, which is peer review.
The notion of peer review has sort of become this gold standard of infallibility, where it's considered to be something it isn't, and that is a perfect way to do science, and that's definitely not what peer review is. There was a landmark case in 1993, Dabware versus Merrill Dow Pharmaceuticals, where the U.S. Supreme Court actually ruled that you did not have to have publication in a peer-reviewed journal in order for something to be good science. Obviously, publication in a peer-reviewed journal can sometimes help you assess whether or not something represents good science, but it is not an absolute indicator of good science. The problem is not necessarily that the peer review system exists. The problem is when politics gets involved, it becomes more of a political tool to enforce an orthodoxy and shut down discussion, to shut down dissent, and to prevent people from having open scientific dialogues over these important questions.
Unchecked, climate change will pose unacceptable risks to our security, our economies, and our planet. This much we know. This is not fiction, it is science. I believe we can act boldly and decisively in the face of a common threat.
The new oligarchy must increasingly rely on the advice of scientists, till in the end the politicians become merely the scientists' puppets. I dread government in the name of science. That is how tyrannies come in. In every age, the men who want us under their thumb will put forward the particular pretension which the hopes and fears of that age render most potent. They cash in. It has been magic. It has been Christianity. Now it will certainly be science. Perhaps the real scientists may not think much of the tyrant's science. They didn't think much of Hitler's racial theories or Stalin's biology. But they can be muzzled.
I confess to having reservations about this conclusion because it does sound rather authoritarian. Have I been led to an Orwellian conclusion? I don't know.
There are many hypotheses in science which are wrong. That's perfectly all right. It's the aperture to finding out what's right. Science is a self-correcting process. The suppression of uncomfortable ideas may be common in religion or in politics, but it is not the path to knowledge. and there's no place for it in the endeavor of science.